Christopher Desson. Christopher has been owner and publisher of Global Water Intelligence since 2002. I got that right. In 2003, he launched the Desal Tracker service to track all the major desalination projects in the world. This in turn led to acquisition of the IDA Worldwide Desalting Plant Inventory and its relaunch as Desal Data in 2004 and the Water Desalination Report in 2005. Christopher is also the mastermind behind the Global Water Summit, an annual event at the intersection of water, technology, and finance. Now, those were things that maybe some of you already knew about Christopher. There's some additional things that you might want to know. Not only is he a publisher and authority on water, finance, and markets, but also an author and amateur theologian. And those were not my words, those I think were self-described. He has degrees in politics, philosophy, and economics. And I think he's going to light a fire under us. So, Christopher.
Okay. So, some fire for you all. I was going to talk about the future of desalination. And it's not the technology. I mean, you're all here to sort of invent clever things and so forth. But actually, that's not our problem. The problem is everything else around desalination. But I think it's useful that you actually understand the context of all of this. So first of all, I'm going to start with a bit of data, and then I'm going to go into 5 of the big issues that we face. So here we are, just looking at the history of desalination capacity since 2000. And it's a lot of heartache in this for me. Because at Global Water Intelligence, one of the things we do is try to forecast the market. And back in, I suppose we first published a market forecast in, I think, 2004. And it basically went like this. It went up, and like this. And we just thought the market was unstoppable because at that stage, everything was happening. We had, suddenly in the Middle East, they were after 20 years, they were building desal plants to catch up with 20 years of demand they hadn't been catering for because the oil price was high. There was that big drought in Australia, the Millennium Drought. The Algerians all decided they needed desal. The whole world seemed to be suddenly deciding that desal was the future. We kept publishing these forecasts, and I think that they went sort of after that year. When it went down to there, I think we suggested it was going to go like this, but we never suspected it would come down all the way there in 2014. And I suppose that this is one of the things that one has to remember, that there's a lot more to the desal market than just there being a fixed amount of fresh water and growing demand and everyone wanting to get more fresh water from the sea. It's been a lot more of a lumpy path. At the moment, looking forwards at what is the next 5 years, these forecasts are based on our project tracking. So quite a lot of it is already known because they're very big projects in Saudi Arabia, which maybe like 1 million cubic meters a day of capacity. That's quite it's a material chunk in this graph. But actually, what's happening is the market is spreading out beyond the Gulf region, or at least for the last 5 years, the growth has been very heavily dependent on the Gulf. What's been happening in the Gulf is not only is sort of growing demand, but also the replacement of all of the old thermal desal plants has been a sort of double boom in the Gulf region. And that will sort of play out at some stage, but will the rest of the world catch up? I put some data here just showing what the price trends have been. These are price trends from IWPs, i.e. independent water projects, where they're privately financed and operated and so forth, on the basis of what they call the levelized water price, i.e. a price which combines the capital cost, the operating cost, and the cost of capital in a single water price. And the sort of low bid there, I think, is something like 37 cents a cubic meter for the Hassian project in Dubai. And you know, the way that that was achieved is probably nothing that anyone in this room would think was clever. For example, most of the projects in the Gulf have a 25-year tenor of the contract, but the Hassian one has a 35-year one, so the capital cost can be written off over 35 years, and that's how they managed to get that very low. But actually, most of these very low-priced, sort of 40, 50 cent desal plants have been achieved really as a result of economies of scale. And I think also probably a lot of you would feel that this is a sort of backwards move in desal, in that with these very large plants, they're not trying to do anything clever. They're really just trying to take stuff out. And you know, the pre-treatment systems that they're using on these very big plants in the Gulf now are probably more simple than the pre-treatment systems that people were trying out 15 years ago. I mean, things like ultrafiltration used to be the future. It's not at all. That's that. But next, these are the 5 things that don't really work in desal. The first one is here in America. This is madness. This is the thing. There are 2 bits of madness. The first bit of madness is here in Corpus Christi. The second bit of madness is in Saudi Arabia, actually some place where Nicola is pretty familiar. So this madness is that, you know, they're trying to build this desal plant here, and the cost of it is just so completely beyond conception. So this here is a chart showing the capacity cost of building a desal plant. So this is just the capital expenditure, yeah? And we take the size of the cost of the plant, and we divide the cost of the plant by the capacity to get the cost per cubic meter per day of capacity. And you can see that, you know, in general, the cost of desal plants is sort of between $1,000 and $2,000 a cubic meter of capacity. You know, that's the ballpark that we think. You know, there it is. It's sort of wiggling around that sort of area for some time. And then these crazy people. Now, this is Corpus Christi here, $10,000 a cubic meter of capacity. That's $1.189 billion to build 113,000 cubic meters of capacity. It is madness, and it's not going to happen. I mean, the city of Corpus Christi stepped away from it, but you know, that is just, you know, completely crazy for anyone to consider building a desal plant like that. But it's not the craziest. Here we have, this is the Eyre Peninsula desal plant in South Australia, which managed to sort of cost, what is it? It's like 21,000 a cubic meter of capacity. Now, it's got a couple of excuses. I mean, the first excuse is that it's you know, a small plant. I think it's like 13,000 cubic meters. So, you know, it hasn't got those wonderful economies of scale that you get in a bigger plant. And the second excuse is it's in a bit of a funny location and getting stuff there. But the main reason is the Australians are even more useless than the Americans at building desal plants. That is the way it is. Anyway, the third one there, I mean, this is it's about 5,500 or something. That is this new project in Bombay that they're proposing to build, which very surprising. You know, they came up with a price like that in India. You would have thought the lower labour costs would make it feasible. But actually, it seems that the location is incredibly difficult, and they're going to have to bring all the materials in by sea rather than taking them in trucks by land to get there. So there are some excuses, but why does this happen? I mean, this shouldn't happen. Now, I'll look at one particular reason next, which is the crazy way that Americans try and build stuff. I mean, you probably all blissfully ignorant of this, but because a lot of you come from not America, and very few of you actually get involved in this whole engineering madness that happens. In this country, they have, they used to have this thing called design, bid, build. So, 100 years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a big sort of alarm about corruption in engineering, and these engineers who should be professional, doing the best job, were actually delivering things terribly cheaply, which would all fall apart. And so you should separate out the engineering from the construction, and you'd have one contract for designing stuff and another contract for building stuff. And that would be the way that the designers would be under no financial pressure to do something which might fall apart. They could just build the very best example of whatever it was. They would always come up with the best solution. And then the sort of capitalism would come in when it came to the build part, and they'll have complete competition, very open competition between the construction companies to build stuff. So this design, bid, build model is, the bread and butter of the way that American infrastructure has been built over the years. Now, it's not a very effective thing, because what tends to happen is they design it, lovely designs. The builders start building and says, aha, you've made a mistake in the design. That means we have to have a contract variation. That means we need to have more money. And the actual price of these projects ends up completely crazy, even though the bidders bid competitively. Once they've got the project, they see this as the beginning of a new negotiation to get the prices very high. So the engineering firms, now, have we got any engineering people from engineering firms here? Good. Certainly I don't want anyone who sponsors our conferences or anything like this here, because we do quite well from engineering firms. So I have to be careful what I say when I have engineers in the room. But they're very canny people. They had this idea that the clients didn't like the cost getting out of hand, so they came up with this new model, which they call progressive design build. And this is a way that they can make even more money while appearing to solve the problems of the utility. So what they now do is they say, right, we'll have a beauty parade. A beauty parade is not a tender in a normal sense. It's you come in, you submit your credentials. And the city looks at your credentials and says, well, yeah, so you've worked on that, That's a nice job, we like you, we'll let you do this. It's not, this is, so many, we'll build this desal plant for 1.189 billion. There's absolutely no way that any city would take on an engineer if they said they'd build a desal plant for 1.189 billion. But they will take on one of these supposedly lovely engineers who are all terribly professional, who are incorruptible, and will do the best job as if they're a physician. And then they get appointed without any competition, and they then work up these detailed designs. And then at some point, they say to the client, ooh, this is going to cost a lot of money. And in the case of Corpus Christi, they said, ooh, it might cost more than 1.189 billion. In fact, if you want to know how much more it's going to cost, you're going to have to pay us another 20 billion. And surprise, surprise, the city said, what the hell? And they had this epic council meeting where 4 people were arrested and all sorts of people were in tears, and they walked away from that as a concept. But you can just see what's going on. These engineers do not have to consider competition in any way as they design these plants. Whereas in the Gulf and everywhere else, You might have the engineer who's just advising the client, but that engineer then puts out the RFP for somebody to actually design the plant. And that goes to a developer who is responsible for designing the plant, for contracting the operations, and for building the whole thing. It's a whole package. All they're doing is selling water to the client. They're not selling all this other, they're not involving the client in any of the decisions about the design or the procurement or the construction or what have you. And they're doing this in a completely competitive way. And every cent matters as they push down the price. Whereas in America, the engineers just add and add and add to the price, and then eventually they say, right, we'll put it out to put out this bit to a construction company or this, but we'll fix up. We'll give you a guaranteed maximum price, which is going to be extremely advantageous to them, but not in any way exposed to competition. So basically, anywhere, any city in America which uses this progressive design build is basically, writing huge checks, unnecessary checks to engineers and getting very poor value. Whereas in the rest of the world, we have this business where it's all about delivering the lowest cost water right from the very beginning, and that competition forces the people to really think about how to design this plant so it can deliver water for 25 years at the very lowest cost. And nobody's going to finance it if it falls apart, so they have to build it well, and it's a very sort of watertight way of doing things. Why does it matter? Well, that building a desal plant is really about, I call it building the smallest triangle. There are these three components of a desal plant. There's the capital cost, which has got a large component of delivery risk in it. If you're going to build a plant and then there's some cost overrun, you've got to be able to absorb that. For example, when they built the plant here in Tampa, they originally did it, I think the contract was originally something like $120 million. Was it $86 million? But when they switched it on, the plant didn't work. And the contractor walked away saying, well, we're bankrupt now, so you can't do anything about it. And the city then had to pay an extra $29 million in order to fix it up. So the delivery risk is quite significant. And then you've got the cost of capital, which is the interest rate or whatever you're paying on it. And then there's the operating cost, which is a function of the energy cost. And you can see that there's a trade-off, certainly between the capex and the opex. If you have, let's say, if you want very low opex, you might have a huge membrane area, and you might, have basically gold plate the plant so nothing ever goes wrong, nothing ever breaks, everything's done pretty well. If you want very low capex, you have a tiny membrane area, you probably don't have a second pass, you probably expect the membranes to be replaced every 3 seconds, you don't do the pre-treatment properly, you sort of undersize everything, and you get a low capex. So there's always this trade-off between capex and opex. And it's much better that you give that risk to the contractor to work out what the best balance is, and then hold them to it and say, okay, you've got to deliver this water for 25 years. If you say you can do it, put your own money into it. Whereas in the American model, they say, oh yes, we'll do this, this will work for 25 years, there'll be no trouble, I promise, but no, we're not going to put any of our money into this because we might lose some. So, that is, the central issue is actually, getting, this optimization of all the different aspects and forcing the person who's made the commitment to their designs to actually put their money where their mouth is. And I guess a simpler way of putting it is, do you as a client want a whole construction and site and all this stuff, or do you just want water? In the rest of the world, people are just buying water. They have what's called a water purchase agreement, and that has, they have a water purchase agreement with a company which then builds a desal plant. Whereas in the US, you have, these funny contracts to actually own and operate bits of desal plants. You have no idea whether they're going to perform according to the way the designer said they were going to perform when he designed it. Anyway, that's the theory, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. What about if you've got people who are protesting against your desal plant? And this doesn't happen in Saudi Arabia. So, in Saudi Arabia, when somebody gets awarded a plant to build a plant at, let's say 40 cents a cubic meter, it's taken as read that they will get all the environmental permits on the basis of their proposal. If the proposal is compliant, it will get the permits. Whereas in this country, the politics are so horrible around desalination that if you were to award let's say Nikolai is a veteran of Poseidon, if they had tried to award the Poseidon project on a fixed price before they had sorted out the environmental permitting, Poseidon would have been bankrupt in 3 seconds. I mean, how much did it cost? It was more than $100 million to get it through permitting.
That is correct. Yeah.
And and what had to be built? I mean, they're talking about sort of infiltration galleries and essentially in this country and in Australia and a number of other places, the real negotiation in desal is between the opponents of desal and the proponents of desal over how much cost they're prepared to add to it before either side walk away. So in for example, in the Wonthaggi plant in Melbourne, they were very determined to build it, but there were equally people who were very determined it shouldn't be built. And this protest was actually at the Wonthaggi plant in Melbourne. And if you're an opponent, the way you oppose a plant is to force extra environmental costs on the plant. So, for example, in Wonthaggi, they had to put a pipeline from the city to the plant, which was 70 kilometres long. They thought that initially they could just lay it alongside a road or something. People said, no, it's got to be put underneath the ground. Okay, we can put it underneath the ground, but then they said, well, there's asparagus fields here. You can't do trench and fill across asparagus fields because asparagus crowns take years to build up and we don't want to lose them. So they then said, okay, we'll directionally drill the tunnel to take the water. It's just, these costs just mount up and up. And the reason why they mount up and up is because they're part of the opposition process. If the plant is acceptable to the public at 300 million, it's probably not acceptable to the public at $1 billion. So let's see if we can push the costs over $1 billion, and then we as opponents to desal will win. But this is the problem. There's no possibility of innovation, of coming up with what is the best way of solving these environmental problems in a competitive environment. The way it works is you have the engineer deciding, okay, we'll add this as a specification, we'll add that as a specification, until it gets more and more expensive. And really what's needed is some clever innovation around how can we come up with an acceptable way of getting the best environmental solutions at the lowest possible cost, rather than environmental solutions being part of the process of opposing desal. Anyway, right, next piece of madness. Now, does anyone know what this is? Does anyone know where it's supposed to be? Nuruddin, you should know. You probably live quite close to it, close in this room to it. It's in Neom. What is it? Trojena, that's right. This is the ski resort that they're going to build in in Neom, in north west of Saudi Arabia. What do you think the madness in this picture is? Well, yeah, it's a desert, that's part of it, but that's not the real madness. You might think that it's mad to build a ski resort. It's not just any ski resort. This is a ski resort which is going to host the Asian Winter Games in 2029. And I think they have a few nights a year when the temperature drops below zero. But some years it doesn't drop at all below zero. So this is all fake snow. But that's not the madness. The madness is that all that snow is supposed to come from a desal process with zero liquid discharge. That is complete madness. And it's madness of a planetary scale, yeah? Planetary scale. Because of neon, people now think that desal brine is toxic and should not be allowed back in the sea. Gavin von Tonder, who's the guy who sort of was leading this whole neon thing, he had this vision. He said, we can't have any sort of brine going in the sea because, we've got these lovely reefs in Red Sea reefs at that point, and if we put anything in it, even if, we take out all of the antiscalants and all the biocides, even if it's just pure concentrated seawater. That concentrated seawater is so devastating that we can't possibly do it, and we're prepared to spend tens of billions of dollars figuring out the solution to zero liquid discharge for seawater desal. So what's wrong with it? Well, I think that there is this whole I've just said, the big issue we face in desal is really the opposition to desal and how we manage that. And the brine has become the number one reason why people feel that desal is a danger. They might not like the idea of having a desal by the beach or anything else, but this idea that somehow it's toxic brine that's coming out of these desal plants, that is the number one objection to desal. And it is really spread because, for two reasons. First, there are mad people like Gavin von Tonder out there who just like the idea of doing something completely over the top environmentally. And the second reason is because of people like you. I'm talking about all of you who was in this mining workshop just now. You should be feeling guilty because you're part of the problem. You are the people who are most in the way of desal, yeah? Because instead of thinking, I'm saying when Gavin von Tonder says, we're going to have zero liquid discharge desal, we're going to have brine mining, we're going to sell all the products, we're going to have a circular economy. Instead of saying, look, this doesn't make sense here, it might make sense in San Antonio or one of these places which is inland, where you've got a brackish desal and you've got a heavily, very expensive cost of disposing of brine and coming up with a clever way of neutralizing the brine so you can dispose of it, because you can add the cost of disposal to part of the cost of making the plant work. I.e. brine mining has got a negative. It's addressing a negative value issue as well as a positive for selling. You can sell the salts for this much, but you can also solve the problem which you would otherwise have to pay for. So opportunity cost of disposing of the brine essentially would finance it. There's no true opportunity cost of disposing of seawater brine, i.e. it's not so polluting that you have to pay a disposal fee. But you guys all think it's a really exciting technical problem to deal with. And so you have these lovely workshops where you sit down and you listen to Nikolai and so forth, learning all the latest technologies about doing it. But it should not be done because it just encourages people to think that it's a bad stuff. Yeah? So, that's the main thing. And I mean, I have to say, you know, at the very beginning, we wrote a paper for NEOM advising them on the brine mining thing. And, you know, our view was that, you know, the first thing that needs to happen is actually to develop new markets for the brine mining products. Because, and I think this is some of the things which Nikolai acknowledged, that, you know, at the moment, salt and calcium sulfate are basically too cheap. And if you were to take the, you know, the salt out of the sea at NEOM, and at the scale that they need to, you would completely flood the market for salt globally. I mean, there's just, it would very quickly reduce the, you know, price of salt to sort of, you know, from whatever it is, $80 to $110 for 10 tons or whatever that is, to, you know, a fraction of that. You know, we need to really, you know, the real innovation around brine mining has got to be in the material science area. I mean, I think Nikolai was talking about PVCs and other plastics, and, you know, maybe, I mean, this is the proposal I sent to the Nadvi Nasser, who used to run NEOM. I said, you should build NEOM out of the salt. You know, make plastics, construction plastics, new generations of construction plastics, to build the line or whatever, you know, from the salt and everything else that you pull out of the ground. But, you know, until one's actually got a much better value proposition, this brine mining is something you should keep to yourselves. You shouldn't, certainly don't go off and tell people that, oh, you know, you don't want to build a desal plant because until we've got our new sort of technology for brine mining working, because it will just kill the market. That's the way it is. So what else is a problem? Big is a problem. This is I think the Jubail 3B desal plant in Jubail 3B desal plant in Saudi Arabia. You can see it's enormous. You know, these membrane racks, it's on a scale bigger than anything else. And this is really one of the trends which has been sort of happening in the market in the last sort of decade. I mean, we used to think, I mean, when Tampa Bay built its desal plant, I think it was probably the third or fourth biggest membrane plant in the world. Now it's probably about the 60th or something like that. You know, the scale has got sort of completely out of hand. And why is it a problem? Well, what it means is that increasingly, to build these really big plants, there's no competition. You know, that it's just such a, bidding on these projects. You know, if you want to bid on $1 million cube a day desal plant, you know, you need to spend millions of dollars just developing the bid. And then if you think you're going to lose it, you've really got to sort of question why you're going to bid in the first place. And so initially, for the first few bids in Saudi Arabia for these big plants, there was a lot of competition and a lot of different ways of doing things and so forth. And now there's basically just one player in the market, which is Aqua Power, and there's no real space for anyone else to get in there, and I think that's going to sort of make things a lot less sort of vital. And I think it also means that other companies, for example, Suez and Aqualia, they've sort of pulled out of these big desal plant market. And so, eventually, instead of having, I'd say 15 years ago, there were, I think, about 30 companies which could which had built a plant of the size of Tampa Bay's plant within the previous 10 years. And now there are probably only 4 companies which have built a plant the size of the Jubail plant in the last 10 years, and in the last 2 years, only 1 company which has actually won one big project like that. And I guess one of the big bits of news from Saudi Arabia last week was that Acciona, which was only the only real competitor to Aquapower has decided to pull out of the market because they don't think it's worth competing. And you know, if you haven't got a competition, you don't have innovation, but also you don't have innovation because when you build a desal plant, the reference criteria for building it typically say you need to have built something at least sort of 50% the size or whatever. And so if you want to bid on a plant which is 1 million cubic meters a day, you need to have built something which is 500,000 cubic meters a day. And it's very restrictive on actually getting new innovations into the market. I've got this picture of the earlier barrel here, which I mean, I guess it was probably presented about 6 years ago. Do you think, Tom?
2016, I think.
2016.
17, when they first introduced it.
Yeah, but it's still not. They've not been able to bid yet on a big plant because of this problem of getting the reference criteria. And you know that is. I mean, although you know you can look at it and go, that's just a big pressure vessel. What the hell? The smart thing about it is it's got these little connectors at the end of each membrane module, which sort of monitor the salinity of the water going in and out, which actually make this whole AI proposition for desal possible. So I mean that is a problem. Change is another problem. So I've got a picture here of this is the Santa Barbara desal plant. And Noradine, what's that picture of? Kindasa, yeah! Who said that?
Tom.
Oh, that's the Kindasa roundabout in Jeddah, yeah? So, it's a roundabout in Jeddah, yeah, that's right, but it's the original desal plant in Jeddah. And it's called the Kindasa, which means condenser in Arabic. But Kindasa is also the name of a desal company in Jeddah. And when Santa Barbara built their original desal plant, it rained as soon as they finished it and they decided they didn't want it. And Tom's predecessor wrote about it in Water Desalination Report, and one of their readers, a guy called Alan Bushnak, who happened to be a shareholder of Kindasa, read the story and phoned up Santa Barbara and says, I'll buy the insides. And he sent a boat round to Santa Barbara, loaded up the insides of the desal plant and sailed them round to Jeddah. And so the original Santa Barbara plant is actually still going in Jeddah in some sort of Theseus ship sort of way. But you know, this problem that we face is that as we move from these 24/7 markets like Saudi Arabia, like Israel, you know, like say Algeria, to these climate change driven markets, which like California or you know, Australia and so forth. You've got this situation where people are building these plants just in case, but when they build them, you know, it always rains, and the politicians who order all the spending always get told off. And you know, it's a very difficult problem to solve. You know, how do we get we need a variable solution to a variable problem. And at the moment, it's quite difficult. Yeah, I mean, how do you finance a temporary desal facility? You know, because if you think about these things that cost money, you know, you need to convince some bank that they should give you money to build this thing. But if it's only going to be used for 6 months, or you don't know how long it's going to be used for, and really you need a contract of a few years long in order to finance something. We're in this sort of chicken and egg problem. You know, if you know, there was a company which existed which had lots of, you know, modular desal plants, you know, in boxes, in shipping containers that they could ship to wherever there was a drought in the world, they would have a lot of business. But setting up that company is very difficult because, you know, nobody's going to give them the money until they've got the demand, and the demand's not going to be long-term enough in order to justify the spending. So that is, you know, as we move towards these climate change-driven desal markets, you know, there is a big financing issue. And then the final thing is this problem of getting started. Does anyone know what this is? this is the bane of my life. But I beat them. Yeah, we had a victory over them. So this is source water. They have these hydro panels which use solar power to drive a sort of dehumidifier which drips out bits of water. And they are also the company which has raised most money in the water sector of any startup. I would say a single technology company, because I think that Gradient has probably raised more money in total. But for a single technology, these people raised, I think, $361 million. And this is the problem, that, if they'd asked anyone in this room, was this a good idea to have atmospheric water generators driven by solar power? I'm sure every single one of you would have said, no, this is stupid, this should never be allowed to happen. And you'd look at it and you'd say, look, to condense water from air, if you look at the physics of it, you need to have like a minimum of 150 kilowatt hours per cubic meter of water that you produce. If the desal industry is going at sort of 3.6 or thereabouts, what the hell would you be doing with all this energy in these atmospheric water generators? Don't touch them. But the fact is that with this venture capital world, that anyone's an expert. They come in, they think, oh, we've got some money, we'd like to invest in water. It's a nice story. These things make water from air. That sounds nice. Let's just go for it. And as I say, they take all the money for the startups and leave everyone else, with nothing, with no money at all. So it's sort of, you can see that the things like aquamembrane is quite a nice sort of technology. Membrane spaces, actually does improve things, but they can struggle to raise the money quickly, whereas these sort of mad ideas can raise the money incredibly quickly, in huge quantities. And then I say nothing beats real seawater. I think that this is another issue that it needs to be addressed. That it's fine doing stuff in universities, and showing that these different processes work and so forth. But actually, if you're going to convince anyone that you've got something that works, you need to have real seawater. You need to be doing this in real world conditions. So, if it's going to convince. And the real problem is that there are very, very few opportunities to, pilot, new desal technologies in real world conditions. For example, I'm sure some of you must be aware of this GPID, the Global Prize for Innovation in Desal, which in Saudi Arabia, which was supposed to give people, I think it's small amounts of money, $50,000 or $100,000 for winning. And I think they've had 14 winners in the last 2 years. And the main part of the prize was supposed to be the opportunity to pilot the technology in Saudi Arabia. But not a single one of those technologies has been piloted. Now that is a real problem. And this is the place which has got, somewhere like the Jubail Research Centre or whatever. They've got the facilities, but it just doesn't happen. And really, if you are going to be sort of interested in desal at the academic level, and you sort of imagine that someday what you're doing is going to sort of affect the real world, one needs to figure out how one is going to deal with this big gap. That there's very little opportunity to test new technologies. Anyway, I think that's my fifth thing. You can either, if you want to hear more, you can subscribe to Tom's Water Desalination Report or desal data or whatever. But anyway, that's that. Does anyone have any questions? Nikolai.
To kind of comment on, you said here that making calcium sulfate is really stupid, Brian. And you also said that brine technologies are not good to encourage. But this year, you awarded the Technical Idol Award to a company in the US that makes calcium sulfate. So how is that?
No. What I'm saying is, no. What I'm saying is, what I'm really passionate about is that zero liquid discharge for seawater desalination is stupid. It should not. Nobody should be thinking about doing that. Yes, you can think about calcium sulfate and what have you, but if you're talking, but not in a zero liquid discharge thing. You know, the thermodynamics of zero liquid discharge of seawater just are never going to add up until, you know, there's a complete different construction chemistry in the world.
That's why we did not call that workshop a zero liquid discharge.
Absolutely. No, that's right.
We're looking at valorizing brine.
Valorizing brine, you can valorize brine. Yeah, I'm happy, you're allowed to valorize brine. But do not valorize brine in a way that gives the impression that putting the brine back in the sea isn't actually the most environmentally friendly thing you can do with it.
Absolutely. You know, me and NEOM have actually funded the paper through the IDA, and you can find it, all of you, it's available on the internet, that actually says that brine discharge, there's nothing wrong with the environment in terms of brine discharge, and I'm one of the key authors in the shape and form of Chief Technology Officer for Poseidon, for NEOM. So realistically, you're absolutely correct. At the beginning, NEOM had the wrong concept of going for zero liquid discharge, but that actually has evolved and changed. And I think the industry itself still uses zero liquid discharge, but not necessarily for the purpose of trying to sell everything we make or protect.
Well, if you don't sell everything you get, you've just got hazardous waste left. Yeah? This hazardous waste.
There is no
all these cross salts and other odds and ends that you just end up, the crud that you end up if you try and get rid of it. It's just, you know, it is, as I say, it's a much bigger environmental problem to dispose of, you know, salts that you've taken out of the sea on land than it is to dispose of it inland. So, I mean, so if you can't actually use it all, don't try, don't try this whole zero liquid discharge stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a concept that's 5 years old. And you wrote actually as you said with NEOM 5 years ago, you wrote a very popularizing zero liquid discharge document, which I still have, and I can send it to you.
Oh no, he's going to undermine it.
So, talking through both sides of your mouth doesn't always work.
No, exactly. No, I have to say my attitudes have hardened over the years. What has hardened it has been the way that increasing, it has been this fact that people now talk about toxic brine, and I think that idea of toxic brine came from Gavin. What do you have to?
I'll switch the topic for a minute for you, some help here. So I noticed all the energy and all the attention gets sucked out of the room on these big projects, million cubic meters per day, that was projects. But the amount of smaller projects that are coming up, right? The amount of small, like you said, containerized type of units that are being shipped around to different places around the world, the amount of units that are in the 30, 40, 50,000 cubic meters per day type of capacities that are important to our societies, right? There's enough coastal communities that really rely on these things. So sometimes I feel like a lot of the attention just goes to the big ones.
Well, actually, if you look at the data, the tragedy is that almost all of the growth has come from the big ones. That we have not seen.
In terms of amount of projects, or in terms of total
so
capacity?
If you strip out the big ones, if you take out the plants of over 50,000 cubes, and if you just look at the market for below 50,000 cubes, you'll see it's pretty steady all along. It's probably, actually, if you really want to get into detail of it, that is probably a lot weaker market now than it was 15 years ago, because the main market for sort of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 cube a day plants used to be around JEGA, to tell the truth, i.e. where you had hotels and other developments which couldn't rely on the public water supply to get them water. And there are a number of companies which did pretty well selling containerized desal plants to people who just needed water. And now the big plants came along, they extended the supply right across the city, they basically forced everyone to get off private supply and get onto public supply. And so that certainly in Saudi Arabia, that market has gone. I mean, there's still markets like, the Greek islands and, Caribbean islands and so forth, which steadily sort of carry on with demand, but it's not like there's been an explosion of demand for those smaller type.
No, and I don't mean it in terms of an explosion of demand or not, but I think it goes to the core of why a lot of us work on desalination, and why is it that we need the technologies, and why is it that we need this, is not necessarily because we need a very large plant for a big city that's not managing their resource properly, but because we need to get the water to where people actually need it.
Yeah.
And so there I do like a little bit of we need to make sure that the amount of attention doesn't get taken away from it.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I'd say in Egypt, for example, the government decided that rather than building very big plants, they were going to sort of put them out for bid in packages of sort of medium-sized plants. But they haven't actually been able to get the money together to build that program. And there are some opportunities there, and one can see that in a perfect world, the economies of scale of pre-engineering desal plants in boxes and then just shipping them out and plugging them in would probably match the economies of scale of having a very large plant where you have a single pressure center and huge numbers of membrane racks and so forth. So one feels that the economics of small-scale desal could be improved through the sort of mass production. But I think that a lot of there are, I suppose, three different situations. There's very big plants. There are these sort of desal in a box type things, and then there are these sort of special situations where you're building, things like that Air Peninsula one, which is quite small, or I think there's some around here in California which are quite small, which have got sort of weird setups, which are too big to put in a box, but not having the economies of scale that you get from the very big ones. Anyone for any more? Okay, right. Well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we have welcome drinks outside, and who knows what time